This is an online version of the Systemic Racism in America seminar that I shared last night at church, and I just wanted to record for those who missed it here in my office today. And so this seminar is a 3-week seminar called Systemic Racism in America, and this is session 1 of 3. The terms that are important for us to look at in this seminar are systemic racism and America. I'm not going to spend any time defining the word in, but I do think it's important to let you know what I'm thinking with these other terms. In regards to the word America, I'm thinking primarily of the United States of America, and we're talking primarily about a period of about 500 years of history from the late 1400s to the present. When it comes to the word racism, we're going to spend some time in the next few minutes talking about that word, but we'll mostly be talking about the word systemic today. The story of racism, the word racism, is a very interesting one. A little background on this picture. This is a picture of Richard Henry Pratt, and I'm going to tell you his story with a little bit of background here. So, from about 1839 till 1898, the U.S. population exploded from about 5 million people to 76 million people. That's a huge rate of growth. And at the same time, the native population in America was cut in half from 600,000 to 300,000. And that should cause you to ask the question, what in the world was happening that so many more people were populating this land, but so many less of the native people were populating this land? And the answer to that question in one word is extermination was taking place. And if you think that's too harsh of a term, I just borrowed that term from the first governor of California. You might know that the California gold rush was going on in the mid-1800s. And so California's first ever governor, Peter Burnett, said, as he commented on the loss of life among these native people through war and bloodshed, he said, quote, "The war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. This must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert." End quote. So there was a extermination of the native people going on. And one of the most famous battles in this process took place in the year 1890 at Wounded Knee. 300 Lakota people were killed, while 25 U.S. soldiers perished, and this was known as the massacre, later known as the massacre at Wounded Knee. The public began to feel uncomfortable with this process of extermination. It left them with an ickiness, a feeling of ickiness in their stomach. And so they called this the Indian problem. What do we do about this Indian problem? And 2 years after the massacre at Wounded Knee, Richard Henry Pratt, the man pictured here in this picture, offered a solution to the Indian problem. And his solution was boarding schools. He would take young natives and put them in European-styled boarding schools and assimilate them. In fact, he became most well known for the phrase, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Now, Pratt wasn't new to this kind of thinking. On the issue of slavery, he had said, quote, "Horrible as were the experiences of its introduction, the introduction of slavery and of slavery itself, there was concealed in it the greatest blessing that ever came to the Negro race. 7 millions of blacks came from cannibalism in darkest Africa to citizenship in free and enlightened America." End quote. So this kind of racist mentality of Pratt brought about these boarding schools that were used to assimilate the natives, and they lasted for about 75 years. And it's hard to call Pratt's way of thinking anything but white supremacy. He was basically saying that the best gift that white people can give to blacks or natives was the opportunity to associate with white Europeans and become like us. And the reason I tell you the story of Richard Henry Pratt is because it was about 10 years after that, in 1902, that Richard Pratt coined the term racism. He was the one that coined the term, and he was coining it as a bad thing. He was saying that to segregate, to keep the natives part of their native culture and not assimilate them into European whiteness, he called that racist. Basically, he was saying it's racist not to be a white supremacist, which is an odd thought. But that's kind of the background on the word racist, and I tell you that simply because it's not that old of a term. It's only from 1902, and it's defined differently by different people. Here's a couple of the most common definitions of racism. This one from dictionary.com: prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership of a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. Now, I think that word typically is important there because it is possible for the minority people or the marginalized people to themselves be racist. And so I like that definition from dictionary.com. And the next one from Merriam-Webster: a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. And this shows how stupid racism is, because why base ideas of superiority on skin color? And it could just as easily be hair color or eye color or height or weight or anything like that. None of those ways would be good ways of judging someone's quality. This just doesn't make any sense. We are not to be judges of each other in that sense. And so this is a good standard definition of racism. If I were going to give it a shorthand definition, I would just say hatred based on racial differences. All right, so you might be wondering why this seminar is particularly focused on systemic racism. Why not deal with individual racism? Well, there are a number of ways I could answer that question, and I will in just a moment. But some of the reason for doing this series go back to a blog post that I made in 2005. So I used to blog quite a bit, and back in 2005, late 2005, I did a series of blog posts on different isms that I thought were nearing their death. And I thought that racism was nearing its death, and I gave my reasoning in this post. It says, I have not met very many young racists. Racism is being defeated. A couple generations ago, many people hated those with a different skin color. The last generation didn't adhere the ugliest forms of racism. The majority still categorized people by skin color, but only a minority gauged value by it. My generation doesn't even tend to make a distinction based on skin color, and this is good news. There are still racist people, but racism is becoming less and less of a problem in North America. I'm sure it's still more of a problem in certain areas, but with each passing year, more racists will pass away, and racism is dying with them. And on that triumphant note, I got no comments for a good 15 years. But then I commented just about a month ago, a little more than a month ago. I said, this is probably the single dumbest blog post I ever made. Now, part of me would in some ways defend this post from 2005 because that was my experience. I didn't know many people who exhibited signs of racism. What I'm ashamed of and embarrassed by about this post is that it shows how naive I was to think that racism only existed at an individual level. And it kind of shows that I was living in a very small box of the world where there really weren't many different people to even demonstrate whether racism was still a thing or not. So I failed to understand the systemic nature of racism, and I think that that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do a series on systemic racism and show how this exists at a societal level. So here's some other reasons why this is about systemic racism. First of all, individual racism is obvious. You know, when you hear somebody say something or do something, you see somebody do something that's explicitly racist. That's obvious. You don't need to be taught how to recognize that. You just need to know what to do to confront it. But another reason why we're doing this about systemic racism is that the systemic nature of sin has been a neglected area of Christian theology. For example, I recently read a book on the doctrine of sin, and it was an excellent book. But when the author began writing about systemic sin, it was just the end of a chapter, and it was just a handful of pages on systemic sin. And I think systemic sin is just a much bigger problem than was represented by that page count. Another reason is that the systemic nature of racism is an area of ignorance for many white people. Because we don't deal with racist attitudes toward us very often, if at all, we're not aware of the fact that black people or minority people in America do experience racism regularly. At least many of them do. And so this is an area of ignorance for us, and we need to talk about it. And then finally, some are explicitly rejecting the existence of systemic racism due to our recent racial tensions. I think some people, I've seen tweets and blog posts and Facebook memes and things like that that just say there is no systemic racism. And that is something we're going to definitely talk about in week 2 of this series. All right, I found on Twitter a random tweet that I really liked, so I want to share that. Every sin in the New Testament, including, say, racism, can have a personal dimension, which we call the flesh, a demonic instigation, which we call the devil, and a systemic manifestation, which we call the world. And I think that is a pretty common understanding in Christianity. There are these kind of 3 sources of sin: the devil, the world, and the flesh. We see this in the Genesis story in Genesis 3, in Ephesians 2, and 1 John 5. But really, throughout Scripture, there's this idea that we have the flesh, the world, and the devil as the 3 sources of sin. And in this series, we're going to be focusing on the world. I think that the world is really a synonym for systems, the systems of the world. And so I used to think of it as just individual peer pressure. But I think it's much broader and bigger than that. The world is the systems of the world. That is a source of sin in society. So I want to show you this key passage from Ephesians where we have all 3 of these elements. As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins. That's, I think, the personal fleshly part, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world. That's the system part. And of the ruler of the kingdom of the air. That's the devil, demons part, the spirit. Who is now at work in those who are disobedient. So let me explain a little bit how this works, systemic sin, this world part of sin. First of all, as individuals, we externalize our beliefs, our attitudes, we externalize with our behaviors into society. We externalize into society. There's an output that comes from our hearts. And there's, in society, a collection of all of this individual output, all this externalization. And those collected thoughts and behaviors and attitudes get institutionalized, and those institutions are really more than the sum of their parts. They become kind of their own entity. Those institutions become so powerful that we as individuals internalize the things that we're being taught and trained in by those institutions. So we internalize what we get from those larger institutions, and then we begin to re-externalize our new thoughts, our adapted thoughts. And this is a cycle that goes on and on and on and on and on. It goes around and around. So Thomas McCall says, this is just a comment sharing. He's not the one that came up with that cycle. That was from a different book, but Thomas McCall says the same thing in so many words. He says, so any adequate account of sin will also recognize the reality that sin becomes institutionalized as it perverts and warps social structures and institutions, which then in turn become breeding grounds for further sinful activities. And another theologian, Daniel Trier, says it similarly. Systemic sin and structural evil are the ways in which sin aggregates in social groups. Institutions oppress particular persons or foster communal evils. Cultural contexts do not fatalistically determine individual responses, but they influence personal agency. In other words, it's not inevitable that you will become like the institutions want you to become like, but it is hard not to. We have personal agency. It's not fatalistic, but it is a powerful force. There's a magnetic draw to be conformed to the images of the world. So let's talk a little bit more about this word world. We can use the word in different ways. Like you could talk about the world and refer to the planet Earth or a different planet, or you could be talking about a realm within the planet, like the Roman world would be a smaller realm within the Earth. Sometimes we use the phrase to mean a lot of, like I think the world of you. And sometimes, especially in the Bible, and most especially in Paul, but also in Jesus and John, the word world can refer to a fallen evil system. And I think that's the area that we're going to be talking about in this over these next minutes. So let's start with Jesus. Jesus said this in John 17, I say these things while I am still in the world. He's probably talking about the planet there. He's still in maybe the planet or the Roman world. He says, I have given them your word. He's talking about his disciples. I've given the disciples your word, and the world has hated them. That seems to be the evil system. For they are not of the world. They're not in that evil system. But my prayer is not that you take them out of the world. I have sent them into the world so that the world may believe. So we have a bunch of different uses of the word world here, but some of them clearly refer to the evil system, the evil fallen system. Paul, though, is the one who majors on this use of the word world. We're going to show you a bunch of scriptures now in which Paul uses this language. In Ephesians 2, he says, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air. So there are ways the world works. We use that phrase sometimes. That's just the way of the world. And we usually use it in a sad way. It's sad that the world works in those ways. And notice the connection to Satan there. The ways of the world and the ruler of the kingdom of the air. So Satan is connected to this system. Romans 12:2, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So the world wants to kind of create a cookie cutter. It wants to conform you to a certain image. It wants to kind of brainwash you, but really it's brain pollution. And we need to have a real brainwashing. We need to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. But there's a pattern to the world. We also see in 1 Corinthians 1:20 this idea. Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? The world thinks it knows what's smart. We see it in 1 Corinthians 2:12. What you have received is not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God. So the world has a spirit. The world has its own spirituality. 1 Corinthians 7:31b, this world in its present form is passing away. Now that could just be talking about the planet is going to change forms, but I think it's actually talking about this worldly system, the evil fallen system in its present form. It has a form, a pattern. That's passing away. 2 Corinthians 10:2, I beg you that when I come, I may not have to be as bold as I expect to be towards some people who think that we live by the standards of this world. So once again, pattern, form, standard. Colossians 2:8, see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ. Kind of the basic building blocks of the world, the elemental spiritual force. Notice they're spiritual forces. Once again, a spirituality to the world. Same idea in Colossians 2:20. Since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, why, as though you still belong to the world, do you submit to its rules? So over and over again, we see this idea that the world has a way about it, a pattern, a wisdom spirit, a form standard, a basic structure. All of this is the language that we would use for systems. There are systems in this world. Now, these systems that are in the world can be the smallest thing or the biggest thing. For instance, it could be as small as a men's locker room. In a men's locker room, there's a way that things go. There's a pattern. There's a form. There's a standard. There are sometimes, unfortunately, very low standards of what kind of talk is allowed in a men's locker room. There's a structure to for instance, you wouldn't say the same thing in a men's locker room that you would say at the calling hours at a funeral home. The system of a men's locker room is very different from the system of a funeral. So it can be something small like a men's locker room, but it can also be something huge like a nation. A nation has its own system, its own way of doing things, a pattern, a spirit, a standard, a basic structure. So Walter Wink says this: because the range of meanings assigned to the term world is so wide, I suggest that the special New Testament sense of world as an alienating and alienated ethos may be translated more meaningfully as system. And that's kind of where I got that idea, and I think that he is exactly right. But he's kind of more of a progressive thinker, just to show you that this idea or this thought it has resonance with both progressive and conservatives. Here's a conservative theologian. He says, there are other references where world designates a virtual spiritual force, the antithesis, as it were, of the kingdom of God. It appears to denote the very embodiment of evil, and that's an evil system. So that's Millard Erickson, and that is kind of where we took our first break in the seminar. We didn't really take a break, but we took time for some questions and answers. So feel free to leave some comments if you have some questions. But let me get right into kind of the second half of our presentation. So now that we've established that there is this kind of evil system, the next question is, what is the nature of this system? Is it just heavenly? Like, is it, and by heavenly I mean, is it just evil spirits that are part of the system, or is it earthly? Is it just human governments and human structures and systems, or is it both? So the main thing I want to say is that these systems, I believe the answer is both. And I believe that these systems are more than just the sum of its parts. It's not just evil spirits. It's not just individual sins. It's all those things stirred up together, and those things stirred up together make something new. So I have these illustrations here at the bottom. An ant colony. An ant colony is made up of individual ants, but someone is giving them their marching orders. Like, you kill a bunch of ants, the rest of them still know what to do. The ants die, their progeny come on, and they continue doing what ants do. So there's some kind of ruling spirit to an ant colony. Or a cloud. A cloud is just an accumulation of moisture particles, and by themselves they can't do what a cloud can do. When they all gather together in a cloud, then it can produce things like rain and thunder and lightning and things like that. So we have just some simple illustrations of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. Walter Wink said it this way: the powers, I thought, remember, he's coming from a progressive background where he just assumed that evil was all human made. There was no evil spirits or Satans or anything like that. And from that perspective, he began ministering and found that he was wrong. He says, the powers, I thought, could be understood as institutions, social systems, or political structures. Much of that proved true. It's not wrong. But always there was this remainder, something invisible, immaterial, spiritual, and very, very real. And so he realized that there's more going on than meets the eye. Another quote from him: the diabolical connection, demons associated with the political kingdoms of the world, is highlighted right at the start of the New Testament. The devil showed him, Jesus, all the kingdoms of the world. And he says, it has been given to me. So he was not lying there. The devil really is the ruler of this age, the God of this age, the ruler of this world. He had those kingdoms to give. So we have to recognize all the kingdoms, or you might even say kingdoms is equivalent to the word systems, or a synonym. All the kingdoms of the world are really in cahoots in some way, in some degree, with Satan. All right, so it's probably a good spot to slow down a little bit and say, well, what happened to the world? Isn't the world created by God? How did the world become this ugly system? Well, you're right that it started out good. In Colossians 1:16, it says, for in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. Those are some of the same words that are later used about the evil systems. It says, but they were all created good. All things have been created through him and for him, the him being Jesus. So the system was originally good. The idea of systems is good. The world needs to be organized into systems. That's not a bad thing. But the systems, we know, also fell. They've become fallen and sinful to varying degrees. It says, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm. So you see, some of those same words have now become evil and need to be fought against. So Richard Beck says, our battle is not against flesh and blood, meaning individual human beings, but against systemic and structural evil. I like this quote because I always interpreted this passage as saying we're not fighting against physical things, we're fighting against um, evil spirits and things like that. But it's actually, I think, a better interpretation to say we're not fighting against individual human beings, we're fighting against systemic sin, which includes both heavenly and earthly components. Another quote from Daniel Trier, he says, these authorities may transcend the angelic or demonic regimes of the spiritual realm, incorporating cultural institutions. Their societal effects accumulate not only beyond particular persons, but also across time and place. And it's really the end of that quote that I really wanted to focus on, across time and place. These systems have the power to self-perpetuate. So no matter who the CEO or the president is, or the Congress is, those people pass away, but the system remains the same because it has these spiritual components as well. It has kind of a mind of its own. It is worth noting, though, that the system will one day be restored. They will be healed. The evil parts of the system will be destroyed, but the system will be healed. It says the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations in Revelation 22:2. So there's still going to be nations. There's still going to be distinctions in nations on the new earth, but they'll be healed. All these governments will be healed, and everything evil about these systems will be rooted out, but everything good God made will be preserved. All right. So, to summarize all that, when fallen heavenly powers, that would be bad angels, evil spirits, demons, when fallen heavenly powers match up with fallen earthly powers, that would be corrupt leaders, politicians, CEOs, all that, sometimes even heads of households and things like that. So when those things match up, the heavenly and the earthly, the systems that are created in such a context become evil. As simple as that. So let me give you a historical example. Think of the Passion of Jesus Christ. In the Passion of Jesus Christ account, we have spiritual beings involved. We have human beings involved. We also have systems involved. So think of this. We have Satan. He was putting temptation in Judas' heart, and he was antagonizing Jesus. We have evil spirits, I think, involved. We have Judas himself. It was the flesh of Judas that was causing him to have greed to be able to sell Jesus out for some money. So the flesh is involved there. Caiaphas' flesh, I think his popularity had dwindled. Jesus' popularity was growing. He hated Jesus in the flesh. And so Caiaphas, just an individual fleshly level. Herod, Pilate, kind of the same issues. Priests, but then there's also these groups, these systems, the priests, the teachers, the soldiers, the military, the Sanhedrin, the whole Roman Empire. Why was Rome crucifying people at all? Because they had a system, the Roman system protected itself by killing potential threats or anyone who opposed the system. So we have the devil, the flesh, and the world, or these systems, all in play in the Passion of Jesus. And the interesting thing is, these systems, like the priests, the teachers, the Romans, Pilate, Herod, all these people in places of power were blind to what they were doing. They didn't realize that they were crucifying the Son of God. They were blinded by the systems that they were part of, and that's an important point that we'll likely come back to later, either now or later in the series. Let me focus for a little bit on the heavenly power. So we've kind of described these systems as having a heavenly component. By that I mean like a spiritual component, and an earthly component. By that I mean like a human component. So let me talk to you a little bit about the fallen heavenly powers. I'm going to give you, I think, 5 references here. Deuteronomy 32:8 says, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. So this is kind of a strange scripture, but it seems to be saying that God divided up humankind, into different nations and assigned an angel, a son of God, an angel to each nation. So we get this idea of possibly that there's angels over particular nations. Revelation 12:9 says, the great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. So some of these angels fell with Satan. 1 Corinthians 10:20, the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God, and I do not want you to be participants with demons. So this is saying that, those false religions, they don't just worship fake gods, they worship fallen angels, demons. And so this is real stuff. They have spiritual beings that are claiming godlike status. Psalm 82 says, God provides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. That's from Psalm 82, 1 through 3. So this is a really fascinating passage. God is presiding over an assembly he's in charge of the assembly, but there's a whole bunch of other gods. Now, in Scripture, in Christianity, we're usually used to this idea of monotheism. There's only one God, but Scripture itself sometimes does point out that there's other beings who think of themselves as gods, and God's kind of sitting in an assembly in judgment over these other gods. And notice the particular question that he's asking them. He's saying, how long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the wicked. In other words, he's talking about what's going on in the human realm. He's talking about economic systems and all that. And he's saying, you have some say in this, and you're not doing what I've called you to do, what I've tasked you to do. You're not doing your job. You're doing wickedness in society instead of righteousness. And this is pretty fascinating. Another passage is Daniel 10, another really crazy text. It says, the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me because I was detained there with the king of Persia. So this is a really strange text, but basically Daniel was praying and didn't get an answer. He was praying for a message from God, didn't get an answer, then finds out that there was an answer on its way for 3 weeks, but the angel that was supposed to bring the message got detained by another angel who was the prince of the angel of the Persian kingdom, and then he needed this unnamed angel needed an extra angel, Michael, to help him get past this Persian angel. A lot of weird stuff going on here, but it just kind of shows you that there's a lot behind the scenes of history that we do not know. There are fallen heavenly powers that are part of the systems that are present on the earth, and they have a say. They do things and prevent some things from happening, and some of them are evil. Now let's switch to the fallen earthly powers. So we've talked about kind of the evil spiritual component of these systems, but there's also evil human components of these systems. So Genesis 11:4 is a classic example, the Tower of Babel story. Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. So here we see the Tower of Babel story. Now the problem here is that God had told them to make a name for him and to be scattered over the whole earth, fill the earth. And they said, we don't want to fill the earth. We don't want to be scattered over. So they were in rebellion against God, and they were in unity in their rebellion. And this was an evil system. And so that's kind of the beginning of evil systems in some ways. But we also see it in Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together against the Lord. So these people who were placed in positions of power, they're supposed to accomplish good, because government itself as an idea is ordained by God. He knew there would need to be structure to society, but these people who are placed in these positions of power are using it to conspire against God. They're in rebellion against him. These are fallen systems. Revelation 13 says, the dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. They also worshipped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? So here we have, Revelation's a hard to interpret book, but it's interesting, of all the different interpretations of Revelation, pretty much everyone agrees that the beast out of the sea represents a powerful nation or an evil empire or an evil system. And this is just another demonstration of these fallen powers. Then there's the beast out of the earth or out of the land. It says, it exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast. So the idea here, and pretty much all commentators agree in one way or another, that this represents a religious system that is corrupt. So there's evil religious systems, and we know that from looking around the world. There's evil religious systems that do terrible things, and that's part of the fallen earthly powers. We also have the idea of Babylon. The name written on her forehead was a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abomination of the earth. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. So there's behind all these kind of human governments, there's this spirit of evil government. So this is Babylon, which that one kind of blends between fallen earthly powers and fallen spiritual or heavenly powers. So in sum, what we've talked about in this first session of the seminar is systemic racism. That's been our focus because, for the reasons I gave earlier, we know a lot about individual racism, but I felt like we really needed to understand the reality of systemic racism. It's a thoroughly biblical concept, particularly found in the use of Paul's use of the word world. Systemic sin is extremely powerful because the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and it has spiritual components and powerful human components, and it's got the accumulation of all these different components over time. So it's an extremely powerful force. Systems are very hard to break down. So if they become evil, you're going to be in for a fight. Victory in this fight comes through spiritual warfare. We've got to engage in spiritual warfare. And here's what's really important here. Right now, there's a lot of conflict in the United States, but not all of it is spiritual warfare. There's a lot of people trying to take on racism without understanding the spiritual components and the powerful components that are in systemic racism. And that's why I concluded our seminar last night by saying the world can't afford to fight this fight without the church, this fight against racism. The church needs to be there because the church is the entity that understands the real nature of this battle. So victory comes through spiritual warfare, but the mistake the church has sometimes made is thinking that the spiritual warfare is only kind of praying against evil spirits and things like that. Like we can just pray our way to victory alone. What the church needs to realize is that these systems are not just evil spirits. These systems take the form of governments and laws and practices of a nation, the behaviors of a nation. And so we need to take on the system if we're going to engage in spiritual warfare. That has to be a huge part of what we do to defeat racism in America. Now, you might be wondering, hey, I thought this seminar was all about racism. We didn't talk too much about racism yet. That's what's coming up in the next part of this series. Here's where I want to go in the next session. Is racism a systemic problem? I'm going to answer that in the affirmative, and I will argue that racism in America is a demonstrable systemic sin by looking at America's origins, founding documents, the slave trade, the laws, court rulings, and present-day stories and statistics. The very scary thing here is that because this sin of racism is so systemic, it has the ability to, even when it's squashed by certain generations or movements in American history, like the slavery was outlawed and civil rights, there was a civil rights movement that accomplished a lot of good things, but because it's a systemic evil, even when we kind of whack one part of the racism problem in America, it just pops up like whack-a-mole, just pops up in another area. So we go from slavery to Jim Crow to the new Jim Crow to some of the stuff we're seeing today. And so this next session is going to be about making sure we know the history of that powerful force. And then in week 3 of the seminar, we'll talk about how we can combat this. But just as wrapping up here, you got some homework. You can look on our Facebook group. Nathan has assigned some homework, listening to some interviews and responding to some questions. I also want to make you aware that there's going to be a movie night. We're going to watch the movie Just Mercy Tuesday at 6:30, and that's extra credit if you come to that movie. Not that the extra credit really means anything, but it's a good movie. And then next week we'll get into the second part of our class where we talk about the history that I just referred to. So I hope you enjoyed this first session. Sorry that you had to miss it for a variety of reasons, but glad we could present this online so that you can catch up. And I hope to see you next Tuesday for the movie and Wednesday for week 2. Bye-bye.